Hello, everyone. Today we are going to continue our end game course. And last time I spoke about key squares, and today we are going to talk about critical squares. Now, let me forewarn you that some teachers might use critical squares and key squares interchangeably, which is just fine. I'm not knocking anybody's teaching methods. It just depends on where you're from, which grandmaster, you learn from, etc., or international master or master that you learn from. And a lot of times it comes down to a matter of semantics. But for cases of my presentation, I chose to use the term key squares to specifically define positions where the one side has a king and pawn and the other side just has a lone king. Okay, and critical squares are going to be used to define the position, unlike positions that you see on the board where you have a king and pawn versus king and pawn. So with the key squares, only one side can win the game, right? In other words, if it was this pawn was moved, then we would be talking about key squares. And if you remember the lesson from key squares, in this position, the key squares are um, E7, right? F7, D7, okay? And also D6, E6, and F6. So the six squares in front of the pawn. And remember, that only applies once the pawn crosses over the border or the fourth rank, so to speak, right? That imaginary line in the center between the fourth and fifth ranks. Then there's six squares that the six squares in front of the pawn would be the key squares. If the pawn was only on the fourth rank, then for instance, if that pawn was on e4, the key squares would be d6, e6, and f6. All right. But now we're talking about critical squares. And again, any questions on that, just go and look at my video on key squares. Okay, so let's put this guy back. All right, so what are critical squares? Critical squares, again, apply to king and pawn versus king and pawn. And the critical squares are the three squares on either side of the pawn. So critical squares to me are a little bit easier to learn than key squares. So for instance, in this example, right, the critical squares, right, are, looking at the white side first, the critical squares for white are F5. They're all in the fifth rank, okay? Three squares on either side of the pawn. So F5, G5, and H5. So here, here, and here, right? On one side, and on the other side is D5, C5, and B5. That's it. Those are the critical squares for white. Looking at black, same thing. F6, G6, H6, and D6, C6, and B6. Those are your critical squares for black. Real simple. And now we're going to look at some end games. Okay, so now I explained to you what the critical squares were. Now, why is it important? Well, what that means is that if the king reaches, right, those squares, then the pawn falls by force. That's what that means. So in other words, if it's white to play, as it is in this position, you know that the critical squares, right, for black are F6, G6, and H6, and also D6, C6, and B6. So you know that if you can reach one of those squares, then that pawn, right, the E pawn, will fall by force. And it works the same way for black. If black can reach the critical squares, right, for white, which are F5, G5, and H5, along with D5, C5, and B5, the white pawn will fall by force. Now, this position that you see right now is a position from Chess Player and composer Grigoriev from 1922. Now, with what I just told you, is white to move, it's really easy to see that white can win the pawn by force. Now, notice I did not say that white can win the game, right? You would have to um, calculate further, because after the pawn falls by force, which I already told you at a quick glance it will with white to move, once the pawn falls by force, then you have to decide whether you can win the simple king and pawn endgame, and then that's where your knowledge of key squares comes in. So, as I always say, to learn chess properly, it's good to start at the end game, because you see how things build together. See, first you learn, just king and pawn, and then you want to move to, those type of end games, king and pawn versus king and two pawns versus king, etc., etc. All right, until you have that down. Then you add another pawn on the other side, and then you learn those endings, and you move on and such. All right, but let's look at this position. So we know what the key squares are with white to move. So at a glance, I already know I can win this pawn on e6, right? Because even though black is at f7, white can reach the h6 square, which we have already shown is one of the critical squares. So the first move for white is king h6. All right, how does this work? Now you can see black is forced to move. He's in a zugzwang. So king e8, king g6, king e7. There it is, right? Taking the opposition. Right, now black is forced to move again. King g7, king e8, king f6, king d7, right? Putting up the best defense. King f7 again. And now the pawn falls. King takes e6. Now we're in a different stage. Now, so we've won the pawn by force, but now we have to look at the key squares. Now I already pointed out the key squares to you in the beginning, right? If you remember. So with that in mind, we already know that this is winning for white without even further analysis. But the line continues. The game continued in the study. King e8, king d6, king d8, e6, king e8, e7, and black gets squeezed out of the position. Right? He's forced to move here. And once he moves there, then white is able to move his king to d7. Okay? So you see how the critical squares translate into the key squares. And you can see how positions break down. And this is how why grandmasters are so strong. They literally have thousands of positions, of simple positions, right, in their head. And when they're looking at a position that's complex, they can break it down to a position like this. Now, this position is extremely simple right here. But this is how we have to start with these type of positions, and they get more complicated. And this is one of the secrets behind Capablanca's great success, is that he would go into certain middle game positions, and he knew what kind of end game, that he was going to reach. He knew he knew his end game so well. He knew, okay, if I go in this direction, I'll get this type of ending, and this ending will be advantageous for me. So here, once again, critical squares are the three squares, right, that are directly parallel with the pawn. So again, the critical squares for black are right on the 6th rank. 3 squares to either side. So f6, g6, h6, d6, c6, b6. Okay, so boom, 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 and boom, boom, boom. And for white, critical squares, boom, 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 and 3 squares on the other side. So I hope you guys have that. And again, what the importance is that if you can occupy the critical squares of your opponent, that means you can win the pawn by force. That's why you can glance at this position and know that white can win the pawn by force. And again, if you combine that knowledge with the knowledge of the key squares, you will also know that you will be winning also. But first things first. So you know that you can win the pawn. You win the pawn. And then since you know that you're occupying the key squares already, right? Because e6 is one of the key squares, you know you have that in the bag. So even though black takes the opposition, unfortunately he has to take a L because he's forced to move. And there it is. All right, let's keep it moving. Let's look at some examples and drive this point home. And you guys are smart out there. I know you already got it, and you probably hitting yourself in the head like, man, why didn't my chess coach tell me about this? Or why don't they just write this in the books real clearly? You see, that's what's funny about a lot of chess books. Like you can read tons and tons of books, and they don't explain just simple stuff like that. But let's keep it moving. All right, here's our next example. Again, white to move. Again, remember the critical squares for black here, right, are H6, and again, that's where the board ends. So we can't keep going out, and on 3 squares on the other side. So F6, E6, and D6. So, and the critical squares for white are the same thing. Is F5, F5, E5, and D5, and of course, right here. So with white to move, white is trying to reach one of those critical squares. So what you have to think of is, well, which square is white most likely to have access to? Is white gonna be able to get over there? Probably not. Right? What about this square? That's pretty difficult. What about this one? This one is probably the one that you should shoot for. And you have to calculate that. And of course, black will try to defend that. And of course, black would like to get here too, but it's white to move. So black is not going to be able to get to white's critical square because white can just move up and block all of that action. So let's look what happened in this example. King D5, right? Looking at this square, remember these 3 are critical squares for black. Explains black's next moves, King E7. But now, there's a zugzwang. So King E5, white is gaining the opposition. Now black must move. Now no matter where he moves, he's going to give up a critical square. This lets me know this pawn is going to fall by force. Because if he goes here, you know where to go next, F6. If he goes here, you go to D6. So King F7, King D6, King F8, approach the pawn, King G7, again, same thing, little zugzwang action, King G8, King F6, H7, King F7, and the king is forced to move away. King takes G6. Again, armed with your knowledge of key squares, you should know that this is a win right here. Let's look at our next example. This is a composition by a player named Duran, 1860. So it just shows you how old this information is, and you're just getting it in 2017. 1860. Okay, again, white to move. But before you even think about that, just answer the question: Can you win the pawn? Can you win the black pawn on D5 by force? You should be able to, as soon as you see the position, you should know you can win the pawn by force. Now, winning the game is a different animal altogether because, again, then there's key squares that come into play. But right now, we're talking about critical squares and can we win the pawn? Right? If we're white, can we win the D5 pawn? Of course we can because we can occupy a critical square. Remember, the critical squares here, G5, F5, and E6. All right, so let's get into it. So now that you got the critical squares down, you got this these 3 squares here for black, 3 on this side, so that's 6 all together. And for white, you got these 3 and these 3 right here. So with white to move, it's very easy to assess the win of the pawn with the simple move King G5, entering into a critical square. All right, had a few interruptions. Apologize. My dog is barking and stuff. I tried to get her to play chess, but she just doesn't understand control of the center. All right. So king g5. So we know we can win the pawn by force. Just looking at the position, we know we can enter the square. King g5, king e7, king f5, king d6. Same process. Drive the king away. Valiant defense, of course, and notice the pattern. Now, this position is different because notice that the point that comes into play here is the importance of understanding the key squares. So right there we can see, okay, after king c7, white just simply wins the pawn. Okay, so what's important to understand at this point, right? Let's go back. So say, right, it's white to move here like we just stated, but say you're playing the black position. So armed with this knowledge, you already know that, okay, I can't defend that pawn. So you're not trying to defend it per se. Of course, if your opponent blunders and he doesn't understand critical squares, and you could defend the pawn by all means, because you might, win his pawn. But let's say with correct play, you understand that the that you can't hold d5, right? What you must understand, however, is the critical key squares, right? So in this position, the key squares that white must be able to occupy with this king to win the game, right? At this point, all right, remember key squares, not critical squares. The key squares that black must occupy in order to hold the draw here, or I'm sorry, the key squares black must prevent the white king from occupying in order to hold the draw are the squares c6, d6, and e6, right? So black understands that, hey, I can't hold this pawn. So you should start calculating as if this pawn were gone and you're trying to draw this position here. You understand? In order to draw this position, black must prevent white from occupying this square, or this square. These are the key squares in the position. So with that in mind, let's look. So first, white goes about to win the pawn. Black, of course, puts up a nominal defense. Now he understands, hey, I cannot hold the pawn, but where do you go? Do you just give up the game and say, "Oh, I'm lost anyway," and go here and put the king here or go here? No, because you understand that, hey, if I can block the white king from getting to c6, d6, or e6, I can draw the game. This is why this move is critical. King c7, because now watch what happens. White wins the pawn, but now after king d7, how is white going to occupy one of these key squares? He can't. Okay, king e5, and now again with your knowledge of key squares, where does the black king go to hold the draw here? Okay, if you want, you can pause the video, think about it. But for those of you that have been studying, you already know king e7, because you must keep white out of these squares with the pawn right here in the fourth rank. And again, if white went to that side, would you go here? Well, if you did, you would lose, because after king c6, then white would be occupying one of the key squares. No, you stay right there, because you understand you must keep white off of these squares. So after king e5, king e7, and if king c5, then king c7. Let's look at another example. This is from an actual game, Havana 1962, between Pachman with the white pieces and former world champion Vasily Smyslov with the black pieces. So white to move here. Okay, Smyslov is coming down the board, okay, from top to bottom of your screen, and it's white to move. Okay, Smyslov has the black pieces, Pachman has the white pieces. All right, Now, looking at the position, right, Pacman understands that, hey, I can't stop black from reaching my critical squares. Just for, um, to hammer it in, what are the critical squares here for Pacman, for white? F4, G4, and H4, along with D4, C4, and A4. So it's pretty obvious that even with white to move, there's no way he can stop black from getting at least to this square. Okay? So therefore you should know, or I mean therefore Pacman knows already there's no way he can save this pawn. Alright? Now, black's critical squares are F5, G5, and H5, along with D5, C5, and B5. So with white to move, Pacman understood the situation that I will lose this pawn, but I will try to make a draw here. So those are the critical squares. Now you must know where the key squares are. Well, for black, the pawn is on the 5th rank. It hasn't crossed over this imaginary line yet. So therefore, the key squares are D3, E3, and F3. Okay? So Pacman has to keep the black king off of these squares. So keep that in mind. So king G2, king C5, king F3, king D4. So there's the pawn. The pawn is going to drop, and king F2. You see? It keeps the black king out of these squares, and it's a draw. Okay, this is from an actual game. But if you don't have that knowledge, you can easily just lose the game, because you might make the mistake of trying to say go after this pawn or something like that, and then just dropping this pawn. Okay, you have to be able to understand those positions. So I think that's enough examples already. But let's keep it moving. Okay, so here we have black to move. And the same thing. By now you should know the critical squares. So I'm not gonna you know name them for you. So here, white and black are right in the midst. White is already in black's critical squares, where black has to make one move to get there, but it's black to move. So in this position, would you try to enter here? Okay. Problem with king e5 here, right? Say you try to do that. Remember, white is already there. Then king c6 takes place, and then how does black defend his pawn? You see, so with both players already in the critical square range, you have to calculate, okay? Because in this position, white strikes first. So therefore, understanding that, black plays the move king e7. Okay. Now again, the key squares in this position. Remember, the pawn has crossed the this imaginary line here, so the key squares become c6, d6, e6, along with 3 more squares. So 6 squares all together. These 6 squares right here are all the key squares now. So black has a lot of defending to do here. Can he defend it? So after king e7, king c6, the pawn falls, king d8, king takes d6, king d8, e6, king e8, d6, king d8, and d7. And you should know that that position is lost already, because these are the key squares. So once white is in there, there's nothing that black can do, and he gets squeezed out of the position. Now Here's the same position with white to move here. Now, what would you play here? You know what the critical squares are, but again, both players are right near where they have to be. Okay, so you could take a quick guess. Give you a second. Okay, so if you chose king c6 with this direct attack, okay, then you would lose because after king c6, king e5, the white king is forced away, and then you would just drop the pawn. So you have to play king c7. This gives you an attack, and then when white defends, when black defends with a king e5, the extra tempo forces forces black's hand. Okay, so those are just some more, those positions, as you can see, start getting a little bit more complex, but I don't want to go too far out of the scope of this lecture, and I want you to understand just critical squares. I'll show you one more example, and that will be it. Again, with black to move here, he plays the same idea. He plays king e4, not the direct attack. Okay, that's why you have to calculate, because again after c6 he's forced away. So black to move, he attacks, right, and gives himself that extra space, right? And now white is forced to move. Again, same thing. And this will be the last problem right here. Now this problem is a composition made by a player named Berger, 1889. And here, this problem is more complex because the pawns aren't fixed. Black is able, right, to move. It's black to move, but he can move his pawn or his king. The other positions we looked at, only the king could move here. However, considering the position and thinking about critical squares, at this moment, the critical squares for black are b6, c6, and d6, along with f6, g6, and h6. So if this pawn stayed here, say the white king moved, say like to g6, then it's easy for white to come into the critical squares. The game could end up being a draw here. Okay, remember at the same time, the critical squares for white are here, here, and here, 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 and here. So the proper move is king e5, moving the critical squares down, right, down one rank off the 6th to the 5th rank. And then say after king c6, king g6, king d5, king f6, king d6, right? He realizes he's going to lose his pawn, king f7, king takes e5, and king e7, and it's a draw. Okay, it's very important, and this comes about from understanding critical squares along with the key squares. If he allowed white to move his pawn here, then it would be a win for white. Let's look at it again. So e5 allows the black to fix the key squares for white here. So he understands, hey, I'm going to lose the pawn, and then he creates a draw. Same position, just with white to move, so that you can understand what I'm talking about. And that's how chess is. Sometimes things are just from, rise or fall on the difference of just one move. So white to move, he plays e5. Once he crosses this border, now he has 6 critical squares, which are these. Excuse me, 6 key squares. So now watch what happens. King G6. This is black's only legitimate plan, is to try to win that, of course. King C6, King G5. Of course, he can't move. He can't attack the pawn directly because of the positions we showed before where he would be forced to move. So he plays King G5, King D7. Again, they're playing cat and mouse. If he attacks the pawn directly, then he defends, and then white is forced to move. So that's why they're not approaching the pawn. It looks like there's like a force field. King G5, and then King D7, and he attacks it indirectly where he has this extra move here. King F5, and then King D6. Black is forced to move away, and then white will pick up that pawn. Okay. And just to show you that's not the only win with white to move, King C6 is also possible. Then E5, King D5. And here white would win also. Why? Because he occupies one of the key squares here. In this case, D6. Okay, and just to contrast that, same position with black to move. This is the first one I showed you. Plays E5, and he's able to draw the position. And this is because black stops white from occupying any of these key squares at the end. So that concludes our lesson on critical squares. So we mixed it up a little bit with reiterating what key squares were and trying to combine them a little bit. So hopefully that clarifies that and you improve in your end games. All right, I'll see you guys on the next video.